Hello, this is Ken Briggs with the Current History Podcast. Welcome to this first podcast. This is really an experiment right now, maybe a kind of rough, so buckle in. So today, the focus of this podcast is going to be on the foreign policy of Donald Trump and kind of talking about this two-track policy that we saw in the last Trump administration and we're starting to see now with Trump's brand of personal diplomacy via Twitter and the official policy that's carried out by the defense and state bureaucracies. And then also we're going to talk about some of the things going on in the world. So, for example, the escalation of the fighting in Ukraine, U.S. allowing Ukraine to use American-made missiles in Russia, which is something the Biden administration has been reluctant to do for a while over fears of a nuclear conflict. Kind of surprising that he would wait until now to do this, and I'll discuss why I think he did. And then, the return of diplomacy by tweet with the recent news about tariffs that was announced through Trump's True Social account. Also, the ceasefire in the Middle East. So let's get started. So first thing, foreign policy of Donald Trump. Now, this is kind of an interesting topic to discuss because predicting what Trump himself is going to say and what he's going to announce through his True Social platform and what he announced formerly through Twitter back in his first term. It's really hard to know what he's going to do. I think one thing I've identified him trying to do is he thinks having this sudden volatile approach is some sort of leverage in negotiations. And maybe that's not what he thinks. I don't know. He's a hard man to read. But I think there are some commonalities that we can see from this. So going back in history, back to the Nixon administration. So Richard Nixon, when he was president, he came up with this concept of the madman theory, which is that he on purpose creates a appearance of a volatile emotional reaction to an adversary's activities, and that this can be basically leveraged to get your adversary to give concessions so that the president just doesn't go off the handle and launch a bunch of nukes and start a war or something like that. And Nixon used this tactic a few times to extract concessions from the Soviets. Reading about that, there was an interesting incident I didn't know about, which is back in October of 1969. He had put the military on a global high alert, and he ran bombers armed with thermonuclear weapons for 3 days on exercises near the Soviet border. And there was a similar case that I had heard of, which is back in the same year, he used back channels to try to threaten the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. And so, if I were to, in a sense, define this madman theory, it's that the idea that the apparent irrationality and volatility of the president's behavior could extract concessions from world leaders to avoid provocations that could have unpredictable results. Donald Trump, in my view, is trying to follow a similar playbook. And the issue is that it is standard operating procedure for Donald Trump. In Nixon's case, he was kind of a collected guy, intellectual guy. You knew if he was having a volatile reaction, he was really off his rocker, or he really gave that impression. In Trump's case, I remember back in his first term, he tweeted, about how North Korea would experience fire and fury they had never seen before. He threatened Iran in the same way a couple of times. He threatened tariffs. And what would typically happen is he would be given something that was a semblance of a win, and then he basically ignored what he said he was going to do. And that kind of follows a pattern with Trump where, fundamentally, if you want to understand the man, in my opinion, understand what, in his view, enhances his image. And that's what Trump's been all, the last 20 years, decades of his life is he's all about the branding, all about the marketing, all about the appearance. And he's very good at it. And that's how he approaches things. So, you know, country A and B that he threatens, they know more than likely he is not going to follow through on this. And ironically enough, that's typically what the argument his supporters give a lot of times for why these threats aren't necessarily so bad, because oh look, he's not really serious, he's just trying to negotiate. Well, okay, if you telegraph that you're just there trying to negotiate, you know, then it doesn't work as a negotiating tactic. It's like if I was playing poker. I used to play Texas Hold'em a lot in college, and if I was going all in, putting my chips all in, I don't look over at my opponent and wink at him and be like, "Yeah, I'm going all in," but not really. I'm gonna fold on the first hand. So it doesn't make sense from a negotiating perspective. It may sound tough. It may project a tough image. It may look like he's standing up to the people screwing America over. But as far as efficacy, um, I don't think it's very helpful. So it brings us to the latest tweet from earlier this week, where Donald Trump says that he is going to impose 25% tariffs on all goods from Mexico and Canada in order to get them to stop their open borders policy that's causing, migrants and drugs and diseases to come across the border, and fentanyl. And so someone who supports him, who sees that this tweet kind of comes across unhinged, would probably say, oh, it's a negotiating tactic. He's doing it because he wants to solve what allegedly is an open border, and he's not really going to follow through with it. He's going to get an agreement from the two countries, and he's going to back off. So, okay, now you've given away the game there. They know you're going to back off. And I think the response from the Mexican president really showed this. Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman president of Mexico, she basically released this letter, and I watched a video of her announcing the letter, that essentially the problem with the drug crisis is meeting American demand, and that, there are people in Mexico that are dying to meet that drug demand in the United States. You brought up the idea that Mexico would impose its own tariffs in response and would consider deporting Americans. So it doesn't really look like she's particularly concerned. The letter also reiterated the standing commitment of Mexico to help close the border. And that's probably what's going to end up happening is Mexico and Canada, if I were to guess, are going to release some statement like that, saying that they're going to enhance their policy here. And then, Trump's going to release a statement that says, you got the concessions you want on the border. Let's all be happy and trade. And it would be funny if Trump behaved otherwise, because he negotiated the current U.S. trade agreement that's operating between Mexico and Canada that replaced NAFTA, and his threat is pretty much a threat to abrogate that agreement that he negotiated. Yeah, so much for Trump's madman foreign policy. So there's also the second track of his foreign policy beyond the personal. It's the official Trump policy that's carried out by the state and defense bureaucracy, and it's led by his cabinet picks. In this case, Senator Marco Rubio at state, and it appears former Fox News host Pete Hegseth. I don't know if his nomination is going to go through yet. We'll see. But back in his first term, it was driven by a couple of pretty strong-willed, set-in-their-way guys with a lot of experience. So you had Rex Tillerson, who was the former CEO of ExxonMobil at state, and you had General James Mattis, who was a legendary Marine general. The appearance was in their first term that they butted heads a lot with Trump, and I think that's why they ended up not lasting that long. And so Trump's foreign policy at the beginning of that first term was kind of this mix of the traditional establishment Republican policy and this more populist driven one. So I think what you can expect this term is that, because Trump is appointing people who are more yes man, who I don't expect would really stand up to the president, Marco Rubio being an interesting case of someone who ran against him in 2016 and now pretty much toes the line with him on everything, publicly at least. He's going to have his way on foreign policy. Trump is a lot more, and it's going to be along more of this populist theme of trade and reducing the trade deficit and on stopping immigration and on this America First ethos and general skepticism of multilateral engagement. First, on China, what do I think the Trump administration approach to China will be? Well, it's going to be a lot of continuity from the current president. So Biden largely continued the policy of imposing tariffs on Chinese trade, but instead of blanket tariffs and a less targeted approach, he focused it in on sectors judged critical for national security, such as semiconductors, electronics, etc. I would expect the Trump administration to go back to a more broad approach where they want to try to reduce the trade deficit, and in addition to the national security aspect of things. And his picks so far, Marco Rubio at State and Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, those are China hawks. And so I expect this hawkish approach and for this general idea to continue of decoupling from the Chinese economy and what is really a kind of a bipartisan consensus on how to approach this issue. The only difference is really a matter of how aggressive do we want to be on the Chinese. So in the Middle East, the Middle East was an interesting situation because we were moving towards normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Gulf states, which again was another policy that I liked from the Trump administration that Biden more or less continued. And so I would expect an expansion of the Abraham Accords. What you're going to see, I believe, is the Palestinian interests be completely and utterly sidelined. It's basically, the Trump administration is going to say, Israel, here's the weapons, now do whatever the heck you want to solve your security problem. Whereas the Biden administration was in there trying to in my view, mitigate things a little bit. There will be no mitigation. It's kind of clear that the governments of the Gulf states are not interested in the Palestinian issue anymore. They really just want to keep the peace and trade. They have an interest in working with Israel to stop Iran's terrorist proxies, mainly the one in Gaza, Hamas, which has been essentially militarily destroyed, and Hezbollah, which is in the process of having the same thing done to it. That's what's going to be. The Saudis are going to make peace with the Israelis. Everyone's going to trade, and we're all going to be happy, and the Palestinians aren't going to get their state. And not that I don't think they should have one, but that is not the way things are setting up. And I think once these agreements are made in the Trump's second term, they'll be set, and there probably won't be much of a reversal. And I don't think the Trump administration is going to do anything that involves reducing the pressure on Iran. So moving on to Europe, and ironically, the biggest problem in Europe is obviously the Russian-Ukrainian war. But what's ironic is it's also bringing in these other theaters that Trump is more hawkish about, whereas in Ukraine, I feel like his tendency would be more of appeasing Putin. And so now you have the North Koreans, they're in Ukraine, they're in battle. I read a report earlier today that they were the first North Korean military deaths occurred at the hands of Ukrainian missiles. What's been interesting about the Trump administration is there seems to be a complete bifurcation in the party and among his national security staff, because some of the more populist people in his administration, Elon Musk, have tweeted or put out statements or said things that seem to be more sympathetic to Russia than Ukraine. There's kind of a bit of gloating about, how Ukraine's going to have to surrender. We're going to have to quit giving Zelensky money. So there's a kind of a celebratory atmosphere, and there's a skepticism of giving Ukraine more support. Again, that's something I find ironic because most of the money that's allegedly going to Ukraine is actually going to U.S. defense industries here at home, and most of the dollar amounts are being given directly to Ukraine are essentially the dollar amounts of the weapons and equipment and assets they're being given, not direct cash payments. But those aren't the talking points. Anyway, he has appointed several people to his senior staff, national security staff, who are more hawkish on Ukraine, which I find interesting. And I think, Trump, again, it's hard to read, but perhaps he's maybe trying to play both sides, or he's trying to give his populist supporters a bone while making sure that he doesn't look strong, weak against Putin. So it could be kind of a political dance he's playing, and that may be what when it ends up happening. We'll see. I think one interesting aspect of this now is that most people don't realize this, but a majority of Ukraine's military support and essentially all of its economic support are coming from Europe. Now, do I think European support alone is enough to allow Ukraine to sustain a stalemated war against Russia? Um, I don't know. I don't think at current levels of support it can. I think if the U.S. was to withdraw, Europe would probably step up its security provisions to Ukraine. And I know, in fact, that a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, this all gets jumbled, but I do know that the United Kingdom and France did put out a statement to the effect of that, depending on how these negotiations go, they would consider sending ground troops to Ukraine. And that's where I think it gets interesting, where the narratives, especially in this country, don't necessarily line up with the reality, because Europe, it's a core of the world economy, so it has the capability of having a significant defense footprint. So far, it's chosen not to, and that's because of mainly the U.S. Nuclear umbrella via NATO that's been there for 3/4 of a century. But I think you're starting to see that change, and you're starting to see Europeans look at the U.S. as a less reliable ally. And what that's going to do is, maybe it will reduce the amount of resources the U.S. has to devote to Europe, but it will also reduce the United States' leverage at the same time. So you could have a situation where the U.S. pulls its support, and Ukraine's like, okay, we can keep fighting with the weapons you already gave us, and we'll get more weapons from Europe. And then we'll continue this stalemate. Meanwhile, Russia's economy, if you look at what's happened in the last week to the ruble, it's very on edge. I believe the ruble declined to something like 10% relative to the dollar in a week. And that was after more stronger sanctions against the Russian bank that I think Gazprom, it's called, that processes the oil payments. And so you're seeing basically the value of the ruble is back to its absolute lowest relative to the dollar, which was back in March of 2022, the month right after Russia invaded. So Ukraine may see that and they say, Russia's weakening. They've taken 750,000 casualties. Maybe we can do without the American weapons and just make do with Europe. So you could have a situation where European countries, which have a much more skin in the game as far as what happens in Europe, in reality, doing things like deploy NATO troops, which is essentially what you would to Ukraine, which is basically what you would be doing if UK and France, who are nuclear armed members of NATO, send troops. So now you see a nuclear war potentially getting closer and closer, a direct confrontation between nuclear powers, and that could be a consequence of the United States withdrawing from this conflict. I hope they're gaming all those things out, because I don't think that the strategy of using Ukrainian support as leverage to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table would even work. In fact, I think it would make things worse. So we'll see. And I think Europe has an understanding that they have to work with Trump. From discussing with one of my professors, who's plugged into the U.S. Intelligence community, Mark Rutte, who is the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, was made NATO chief, and that was done partly because he had a very positive working relationship with Donald Trump, which wasn't the case with most leaders in Europe in his first term. So he's kind of Europe's Trump whisperer, and there's a good chance that the current policy continues, I think. So we've covered China, we've covered the Middle East, we've covered Europe. I was going to have a section about Latin America, but I think the only thing relevant in Latin America to Donald Trump is the immigration issue. And he's promised this hardline stance that will reduce legal and illegal immigration, even though there's been significant reductions in the last year or so of the Biden administration. But in his words, he's going to make it even better. So central to his plan is the promise of, quote, the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. And so essentially it's been floated that he would declare a national emergency, which would enable him to use the military for domestic law enforcement operations, which is controversial. And obviously he's going to probably reimpose his Remain in Mexico policy. Says he's going to end birthright citizenship for children born to illegal immigrants, which is dubious constitutionally. We'll see if that happens. Reimposes travel bans to countries with terrorist links. He can do that. Let's see. Suspend refugee resettlements. Reduce temporary protected status for immigrants from certain nations. And he has a broad authority to do those things. And there's also a proposal for a more merit-based immigration system that may be difficult because that requires congressional authorization. So, in trade, as I said, it's going to be America first. It's going to be try to revive American manufacturing with tariffs, curb trade deficits, use tariffs as a tool to enforce trade agreements. And so there's just this general protectionist approach with skepticism towards international trade. And that skepticism is going to go into his general diplomatic strategy. And so I would say his policy, in a sense, is emphasizing national sovereignty and skepticism towards multilateral agreements. So, for example, Trump withdrew from the World Health Organization during the COVID crisis. He's a critic of international climate agreements like the Paris Agreement. So the U.S. will definitely withdraw from the Paris Agreement in a Trump second term. And, there's always a rhetoric about defunding the UN and all those things. I don't think things will go that far. But he can do a lot to reduce American involvement in global diplomacy. That's kind of my thought is, the personal diplomacy by tweet with dubious results, and then we're going to have, the standard America first populist approach to foreign policy and diplomacy. I don't think anything here is disastrous. I would say that, in my view, in the long term, it's going to undermine U.S. leadership in the world, even though there's going to be some short-term victories there. But it's going to make the U.S. a less reliable negotiating partner, and I think it's going to accelerate this transition to a more multilateral order where you have competing power centers, of which the United States is obviously still the largest, but they'll transition more into a legacy status as China rises and Europe rises, and I don't think Russia's going to rise. I think it's going to become a part of the Chinese world, but we'll see what happens there. And it's ironic because I think a lot of the support for Trump was driven by this sense of American decline. and a decline in American leadership. And, Trump may come across as a strong leader, but the policies he's proposing, I think, are going to take us backwards on that front. But we'll see, because I will say that, towards the end of Trump's first term prior to COVID, there were some definite policy successes, like the Abraham Accords. So, I have a kernel of optimism, but a lot of that optimism is tempered because Trump is going to surround himself with yes men, I'm afraid. And I don't think the policy that's going to come out as a result is going to be as good. So, putting Trump aside, Trump foreign policy, I feel like he still lives way too much in the national headspace, just like he wants it to be, frankly. But, moving on, there's one issue I wanted to talk about with Ukraine, and that's the U.S. finally allowing Ukraine to use American-made missiles on Russian territory. So the U.S. had provided these long-range missiles, ATACMs, ATACMs, as they're known, and the UK version is the Storm Shadow missile. In the additional year of the conflict, the U.S. Basically withheld these kinds of weapons, period, from Ukraine. And then they finally supplied them, and they said, okay, now you can only use them to strike Russian positions on Ukrainian recognized territory, which included Crimea and the Donbass. But the ironic thing was they were providing long-range missiles for things that could not be used on, for things that were not long-range targets. And the administration kept this policy, I think understandably, because they didn't want weapons made by a nuclear power to fall in the territory of a nuclear power. Obviously, so that, devastation doesn't ensue. And Biden, came of age in government in the Cold War when everyone was scared of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So they had this positive approach. And then for some reason, their risk calculus changed. And I think the incursion of Ukraine into Russia and the absence of a nuclear response to that, Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region, I think the administration realized that the risk of Russian first nuclear use was very small. If they're not going to use it against a country that invaded them, like, are they going to ever use it? So I think you saw that kind of demonstrated, and that was part of the stroke of genius of that incursion. It demonstrated that Russia's nuclear red lines are pretty much empty threats. Even though I think that had been shown in other cases earlier, but that's neither here nor there. So now that Trump is the president-elect, they finally authorized it, and I think that's because, again, of that evaluation of how legitimate Putin's threats are, and also I think the Biden administration thinks that Trump is going to try to force Ukraine to the negotiating table quickly, and they wanted Ukraine to be able to maximize their leverage as much as possible before those negotiations begin. And that is by allowing them to destroy targets on Russian soil like missile launchers and assets that are being used to attack Ukraine. And so the idea there is maybe Ukraine can start to take territory back. They can get some of the initiative back, or at least stop Russia's advance. And maybe we'll have a negotiation where a portion of Russia's territory, of Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine, is just, given up for dead. But we'll see. Okay, and then interesting goings-ons in the Middle East. It looks like Israel and Lebanon are about to go into a ceasefire. I don't think Lebanon really had much choice because Israel had essentially decapitated Hezbollah as a strong military threat. The recent pager attack where thousands of Hezbollah fighters were injured by exploding pagers that were tampered with by an Israeli operation. they killed Hezbollah's leader with a missile strike. They're in bad shape, so they kind of had to sue for peace at this point, and it looks like that's going to come with a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. So, and then with Israel's recent attacks to destroy Iran's missile defense systems, I think this was partly Iran trying to sue for peace because, their proxy in Gaza is gone, Hamas is gone, Hezbollah is basically destroyed, and so Iran's only outpost left is the Assad regime in Syria, which took a massive blow today with the Syrian rebels who were able to invade and recapture Aleppo, which is Syria's second largest city. And so it's basically the American trained Free Syrian Army getting a major win against the Russian and Iranian backed army of Bashar al Assad. And that's a major blow to their both countries' ambitions in the region. And I think you're going to see Iran try to sue for peace to at least stop the bleeding. And I think that's ultimately a positive development for peace in the region, because the major source of unrest is, in my view, Iranian malign activities and the support of Shia militias and militant groups, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, Hezbollah. Putting a stop to that, I think, is a positive development. And it's a development that has to be a prerequisite towards possibly coming up with a solution that averts the worst possible outcome for the Palestinians. And one more interesting thing I wanted to note, and that is this issue, and this is back more towards the European theater. A Chinese flag commercial ship with a Russian captain was detained by the Danish Navy last week on suspicion that it had deliberately cut some telecom cables in the Baltic Sea. I think what they said had happened was it drug its anchor across the ground, across the seafloor through those cables on purpose. And it's just another example of what we call, hybrid warfare, this modern 21st century method of bringing communication systems and cybersecurity and things like that into the fray rather than direct conflict. And so Denmark detained the ship. It was initially reported that they had boarded it. I don't think that was in fact what occurred. And now Sweden is asking to inspect the ship. So I think going to the step of detaining a flagged vessel of China, I think that pretty much means that they're certain that this was deliberate, and it has to be done, through official channels, so no one gets mad and bombs don't drop, etc. But again, I think that's part of what you're seeing with this coordination of China, Russia, and now North Korea and Iran. They're kind of trying to make some noise, shake some things up to try to, reorder the world, make things a little more favorable to themselves. And I think the Biden administration did a decent job of handling it. Are there issues where they could have done better? Yes, of course. They could have been more coordinated on the Afghan withdrawal. They could have been more aggressive early on with supporting Ukraine and not falling for Putin's nuclear bluffs. They could have taken the security threat of Hamas and Hezbollah more seriously, especially with the negotiations between Israel and the Saudis that were going on, that obviously Iran would want to interrupt. But I think on balance, they've dealt with these crises as they've emerged. And in the case of Russia and Iran specifically, they are in, I think, worse strategic positions than they were when Biden took office. Because now, if you remember before the Ukraine invasion, everyone called Russia the world's second military, the second most powerful military in the world to the United States. And they could barely advance in Ukraine, a country with a third the population, much smaller military, and no nuclear weapons. So I think, it became obvious that Europe on its own can stand up and defend Russia in a conventional case. Finland and Sweden were added to NATO, so that doubled Russia's NATO border, and Ukraine's holding them off. And also, Russia has lost a ton of equipment, and as I said before, 750,000 casualties. That's not good. And their economy's tanking. Iran's economy is also tanking. They just had their missile defense destroyed. They had their main terrorist proxy groups destroyed. So, their shenanigans in the region are about done. And so, I would say on balance, even though it looks like chaos right now, I think when the books are written, they'll show that they did a pretty good job. But obviously, we can't predict the future. So, anyway, I hope everyone listening to this had a great Thanksgiving. I hope everyone got to get together with the families, didn't talk about politics, watched some football, ate too much food, and took some good naps, and generally enjoyed themselves and took a break. I know I did the same thing with my family's yearly tradition of stuffing ourselves and then taking a nap while the Dallas Cowboys lose. Thank you for listening. Thank you for indulging me on this first podcast, and I hope to have you tune in next time.